Hello, BookTube. It's time for Chapter 5 of A. Edward Newton's The Amenities of Book Collecting, and it's entitled What Might Have Been. On a cold, raw day in December 1882, there was laid to rest in Brompton Cemetery in London an old lady, an actress whose name, Frances Maria Kelly, meant little to the generation of theatre goers then busy with the rising reputation of Henry Irving and Ellen Terry. She was a very old lady when she died, 92 to be exact. She had outlived her fame and her friends, and few followed her to her grave. I have said that the day was cold and raw. I do not know certainly that it was so. I was not there, but for my sins I have passed many Decembers in London, and take the right, in Charles Lamb's phrase, to damn the weather at a venture. Fanny Kelly, as she was called by the generations that knew her, came of a theatrical family, and most of her long life had been passed on the stage. She was only 7 when she made her first appearance at Drury Lane, at which theatre she acted for some 36 years. When she retired, subsequently she established a school of dramatic art and gave, from time to time, what she termed entertainments, in which she sometimes took as many as 14 different parts in a single evening. With her death, the last link connecting us with the age of Johnson was broken. She had acted with John Philip Kemble and with Mrs. Siddons, but by her sprightliness and grace, she had charmed Fox and Sheridan and the generations which followed down to Charles Dickens, who had acted with her in private theatricals at her own private theatre in Dean Street, now the Royalty, taking the part of Captain Bobadil in Every Man in His Humour. Nothing is more evanescent than the reputation of an actor. Every age lingers lovingly over the greatness of the actors of its own youth. Thus it was that the theatre goer of the 1880s only yawned when told of the grace of Miss Kelly's Ophelia, of the charm of her Lydia Languish, or her bewitchingness in breeches parts. To some, she was the old actress from whom the government was being solicited to do something. A few thought of her as the old maiden lady who was obsessed with the idea that Charles Lamb had once made her an offer of marriage. It was well known that, half a century before, Lamb had been one of her greatest admirers. Every reader of his dramatic criticisms and his letters knew that. They knew, too, that in one of the daintiest essays, perhaps the most exquisite essay in the language, Dream Children, a Reverie, Lamb, speaking apparently more autobiographically than usual, even for him, says, "Then I told how, for 7 years long, in hope sometimes in despair, yet persisting ever, I courted the fair Alice W-N. And as much as children could understand, I explained to them that coyness and difficulty and denial meant to maidens, when suddenly turning to Alice, the soul of the first Alice looked out at her eyes with such a reality representment that I became in doubt of which of them stood before me, or whose that bright hair was, and while I was gazing, both the children gradually grew fainter to my view, receding and still receding, till nothing at last but 2 mournful features were seen in the uttermost distance, which without speech sparingly impressed upon me the effects of speech. We are not of Alice, nor of thee, nor of the children at all. The children of Alice call Bartram father. We are nothing, less than nothing, and dreams. We are only that what might have been." I am quoting not from the printed text, but from the original manuscript, which is my most cherished literary possession. And this lovely variation, of such as it may be called, is the only part of the essay which has been much interlineated or recast. It appears to have occasioned Lamb considerable difficulty. There was obviously some searching for the right word. A part of it, indeed, was entirely rewritten. And just pause there. There's a picture of Lamb and a picture of Fanny Kelly. It continues now. The coyness, the difficulty, and the denial of Alice was it not immortally written with the record of Lamb himself? Miss Kelly's rejection of an offer of marriage from him must be a figment of the imagination of the old lady who, as her years approached a century, had her dream children too, children who called Lamb father. There the matter rested. Fanny Kelly was, by way of being forgotten. All the facts of Lamb's life were known, apparently, and he had lain in a curiously neglected grave in Edmonton churchyard for 70 years. Innumerable sketches and lives and memorials of him, final and otherwise, had been written and read. His letters, not complete perhaps, but volumes of them, had been published and read by a constantly increasing number of his admirers, and no one suspected that Lamb had had a serious love affair, the world accepting without reserve the statement of one of his biographers that Lamb, at the bidding of duty to remain single, wedding himself to the sad fortunes of his sister. Then, quite unexpectedly, in 1903, John Hollingshead, the former manager of the Gaiety Theatre, discovered and published 2 letters of Charles Lamb, written on the same day, July 20th, 1819. One in a long letter to Lamb's most serious vein, in which he formally offers his hand and, in a way, his sister's, to Miss Kelly, and the other a whimsical, elfish letter in which he tries to disguise the fact that her refusal of him has received that he has received a hard blow. By reason of this important discovery, every line that Lamb has written in regard to Fanny Kelly was read with new interest, and an admirable biography of him by the latest and most sympathetic critic, Edward Verrill Lucas, appearing shortly afterwards, was carefully studied to see what, if any, further light could be thrown upon the interesting subject. But it appears that the whole story was or has been told in the letters, and students of Lamb were thrown back upon the already published references. In the works of Lamb, published in 1818, he had addressed to Miss Kelly a sonnet. You are not, Kelly, of the common strain, that stoop their pride and female honor down, to please that many-headed beast, the town, and vend their lavish smiles and tricks for gain, by fortunes thrown amid the actor's train. You keep your native dignity of thought. The plaudits that attend you come unsought, as tributes due unto the natural vein. Your tears have passion in them and a grace of genuine freshness which your hearts avow. Your smiles are winds whose ways we cannot trace, that vanish and returned we know not how, and please the better from a pensive face, and thoughtful eye, and reflecting brow. And earlier in the following year, he had printed in a provincial journal an appreciation of her acting, comparing her not unfavorably with Mrs. Jordan, who, in her day, then over, is said to have had no rival in comedy parts. Lamb's earliest reference to Miss Kelly, however, appears in a letter to the Wordsworths, in which he says that he can keep the accounts of his office, comparing some and some writing paid against one and unpaid against the t'other. This was long before the days of scientific bookkeeping, and much vaunted efficiently, and still reserve a corner of his mind for the memory of some passage from a book, or the gleam of Fanny Kelly's divine plain face. This is an always quoted reference, and sometimes seems correctly to describe the lady who is spoken by many others as an unaffected, sensible, clear-headed, warm-hearted woman, plain but engaging, with none of the vanities or arrogance of the actresses about her. It will be remembered that Lamb had no love for blue stockings women, and speaking of one said, If she belonged to me, I would lock her up and feed her on bread and water till she left off writing poetry. A female poet or female author of any kind ranks below an actress, I think. This shortest way with minor poets has perhaps much to be recommended. It was Lamb's whim in his essay to be frequently misleading, setting his signals at full speed ahead when they should have been set at danger, or at least at caution. Thus, in his charming essay, Barbara S. How unconsciously one invariably uses this adjective uh, in speaking of anything Lamb wrote. After telling the story of the poor little stage waif receiving by mistake a whole sovereign instead of half of one justly due for a week's pay, and how she was tempted to keep it but did not, he adds, I had the anecdote from the mouth of the late Mrs. Crawford. Here seemed to be the plain sailing, and grave editors pointed out that Mrs. Crawford was, they told her maiden name, and for good measure threw in the names of several husbands. But Lamb, in a letter to Bernard Barton in 1825, speaking of these essays, said, Tell me how you like Barbara S. I never saw Mrs. Crawford in my life. Nevertheless, 'tis all, uh, 'tis all true of somebody. And some years ago, not long before he died, to another correspondence he wrote, as Miss Kelly is just now in notoriety, she was then giving an entertainment called the Dramatic Reflections at the Strand Theatre. It may amuse you to know that Barbara S. is all of it true of her having all communicated to me from her own mouth. Can we not contrive to make up a party to see her? There was another reference to Mrs. Kelly, which, in the light of our subsequent knowledge, is as dainty a suggestion of marriage with her as can be found in the annals of courtship. It appeared in the Examiner just a fortnight before Lamb's proposal, in a criticism of her acting as Rachel in The Jovial Crew. Now forgotten, Lamb was, he says, interrupted in the enjoyment of the play by a stranger who sat beside him, remarking of Miss Kelly, What a lass that were to go a gypsying through the world with. Knowing how frequently Lamb addressed Elia, his own self, and Elia, Lamb, might he not suppose that on the occasion the voice of the stranger was the voice of Elia? Was it unlikely that Miss Kelly, who would see the criticism, would hear the voice and recognize it as Lamb's? I love to linger over these delicate incidents of Lamb's courtship, which was all too brief. But what of Mary? I think she cannot but have contemplated the likelihood of her brother's marriage and determined upon the line that she would take in that event. Years before she had written, You will smile when I tell you I think myself the only woman in the world who could live with my brother's wife and take a real friend of her, partly from early observation of the unhappy example I have just given you, and partly from a knack I know I have of looking into people's real character and never expecting them to act out of it, never expecting another to do as I would in the same case. Mary Lamb was an exceptional woman, and even though her brother might have thought he kept the secret of his love to himself, she would know, and I fancy approve. Was it not agreed between them that she was to die first? When she had gone, he would be left. Who would be left to care for Charles? Before I came to the little drama, tragedy one could hardly call it, of Lamb's love affair as told in his own way by his letters. I may be permitted to refer to two letters of his to Miss Kelly, one of them relatively unimportant, the other a few lines only, both unpublished, which form part of my own Lamb's collection. These letters, before they fell from high estate, formed a part of the sentimental library of Harry B. Smith, to whom I am indebted for much information concerning them. It will be seen that both these letters were themselves into the story of Lamb's love affair, which I am trying to tell. So far as it is known, 4 letters are all that he had ever addressed to the lady. The 2 above referred to, and the proposal and its sequel in the collection of Mr. Huntington of New York, where I saw them not long ago. I have held valuable letters in my hand before, but these letters of Lamb, I confess to an emotional feeling with which the mere book collector is rarely credited. The earlier and briefer letter is pasted into a copy of the first edition of the Works of Lamb, 1818, in board shaking, which occupies a place of honor on my shelves. It reads, Mr. Lamb, having taken the liberty of addressing a slight compliment to Miss Kelly in the first volumes, respectively requests her acceptance of the collection, 17th June, 1818. The compliment, of course, is the sonnet already quoted. The second letter was written just 10 days before Lamb asked Miss Kelly to marry him. The bones playfully referred to were small ivory discs about the size of a 2-shilling piece, which were allotted to leading performances for the use of their friends giving admissions to the pit. At one side was the name of the theater, and the other the name of the actor or actress to whom they were allotted. The letter reads, Dear Miss Kelly, if your bones are not engaged on Monday night, will you favor us with the use of them? I know if you can oblige us, you will make no bones of it. If you cannot, it shall break none betwixt us. We might ask somebody else, but we do not like the bones of any strange animal. We should be welcome to hear Miss Liston's, but then she is so plump there is no getting at them. I should prefer Miss Ivor's. They must be ivory, I take it for granted, but she is married to Mr. and then blank, and someone, and become bone of his bone, consequently can have none of her own to dispose of. Well, it all comes to this. If you can let us have them, you will, I dare say. If you cannot, God rest your bones. I am almost at the end of my own bon mots. C. Lamb, 9th July, 1819. This characteristic note in Lamb's best punning manner, I fancy I succeed best in epistles of mere fun, puns, and that nonsense, may be regarded as a prologue to the drama played 10 days later, the whole occupying but the space of a single day. Just pause there. There's the facsimile of that letter, the Bones letter. And now the curtain is lifted on a play in which Lamb and Miss Kelly are the chief actors. Lamb is in his lodgings in Great Russell Street, Covent Garden, the individual spot he likes best in all London. Bow Street Police Court can be seen through the window, and Mary Lamb, seated thereby knitting, glances into the busy street as she sees a crowd of people following in the wake of a constable conducting a thief to his examination. Lamb is seated at a table writing. We, unseen, may glance over his shoulder and see the letter which he has just finished. Dear Miss Kelly, we had the pleasure, pain I might better call it, of seeing you last night in the new play. It was a most consummate piece of acting, but what a task for you to undergo. At a time when your heart is sore from real sorrow, it has given rise to a train of thinking which I cannot suppress. Would to God you were released from this way of life, that you could bring your mind to constant, to take your lot with us, and throw off forever the whole burden of your profession. I neither expect nor wish you to take notice of this which I am writing in your present over-occupied and hurried state. But to think of it as your pleasure, I have quite income enough, if that were to justify me for making such a proposal, with what I may call even a handsome provision for my survivor. What you possess of your own would naturally be proportioned to those of whose sakes chiefly you have made so many hard sacrifices. I am not so foolish as to know that I am not a most unworthy match for such a one as you, but you have for years been a principal object of my mind, and many a sweet amused character I have learned to love you, but simply as F.M. Kelly, I love you better than them all. But you quit those can you quit those shadows of existence and come be a reality to us? Can you leave off harassing yourself a pleasure to a thankless multitude who knew nothing of you and begin at last to live to yourself and your friends? As plainly and frankly as I have seen you give or refuse assent in some feigned scene, so frankly to do me justice, to answer me, it is impossible I should feel injured or aggrieved by your telling me at once that the proposal does not suit you. It is impossible that I should ever think of molesting you with idle importunity and persecution after your mind is once firmly spoken. But happier, far happier than I would have to hope in time come when your friends might be your friends and interest yours. Our book knowledge, if in that inconsiderable particular we have any little advantage, might impart something to you which you would which would every day have it in your power 10,000-fold to repay by the added cheerfulness and joy which you could not fail to bring us in as a dowry into whatever family would have the honor and happiness of receiving you, the most welcome accession that could be made of it. In haste, but with entire respect and deepest affection, I subscribe myself, C. Lamb, 20th of July, 1819. No punning, no nonsense here. It is the most serious letter Lamb ever wrote. A letter so fine, so manly, so honorable in the man who wrote it, so honoring to the woman to whom it was addressed, that knowing Lamb as we do, it can hardly be read without a lump in the throat and eyes suffused with tears. The letter is folded and sealed and sent by a servant girl to the lady who lives hard by in Henrietta Street, just the other side of Covent Garden, and the curtain falls. Before the next act, we are at liberty to wonder how Lamb passed the time while Miss Kelly was writing her reply. Did he go off to the dull drudgery of the desk's dead wood at East India House, and there busy himself with the prices of silk, or tea, or indigo, or did he wander about the streets of his beloved London? I fancy the latter. In any event, the curtain rises a few hours later, and Lamb and his sister are seen as before. She has laid aside her knitting. It is late afternoon. Lamb is seated at the table, endeavoring to read, when a maid enters and hands him a letter. He breaks the seal eagerly. Again, we look over his shoulder and read. Henrietta Street, July 20th, 1819. An earlier and deeply rooted attachment has fixed my heart on one from whom no worldly prospect can well induce me to withdraw it. But while I thus frankly and decidedly decline your proposal, believe me, I am not insensible to the high honor which the preference of such a mind as yours confers upon me. Let me, however, hope that all thought upon this subject will end with this letter, and that you henceforth encourage no other sentiment towards me than esteem in my private character, and to continuance of that approbation of my humble talents which you have already expressed so much and so often to my advantage and gratification. Believe me, I feel proud to acknowledge myself your obliged friend, F.M. Kelly. Lamb rises from his chair and attempts to walk over to where Mary is sitting, but his feelings overcome him and he sinks back in his chair again as the curtain falls. It moves quickly, the action of this little drama. The curtain is drawn but a moment suggesting the passage of a single hour. When it is raised, Lamb is alone. He is but 45, but looks an old man. The curtains are drawn, lighted candles are on the table. We hear the rain against the windows. Lamb is writing, and for the last time we intrude upon his privacy. Now poor Charles Lamb, now Charles, dear Charles Lamb, St. Charles, if you will, our hearts go out to him. We would comfort him if we could, but read slowly one of the finest letters in all literature, a letter in which he accepts defeat instantly, but with a smile on his face. Tears there may have been in his eyes, but she is not to see them. See Lamb in his supreme vole of a man. How often had he urged his friends to play that part, that difficult part, which no one could play better than he. The letter reads, "Dear Miss Kelly, your injunctions shall be obeyed to the title. I feel myself in a lackadaisical, no-howish kind of humor. I believe it is the rain or something. I had thought to have written seriously, but I fancy I succeed best in epistles of mere fun, puns, and that nonsense. You will be good friends with us, will you not? Let what has passed break no bones between us. You will not refuse us then next time we send for them. Yours very truly, CL. P.S. Do not observe the do you observe the delicacy of not signing my full name? N.B. Do not paste that last letter of mine into your book. We sometimes mistakenly say that the English are not good lovers. To think of Charles Lamb may help us to correct that opinion. All good plays of the period have an epilogue, but by all means, this should have one, and 10 years later, Lamb himself provided it. It appeared in the Examiner, where, speaking of Fanny Kelly's acting in The Hypocrite, he said, "She is, in truth, not famed to tease or torment, even in jest, but to utter a hearty yes or no, to yield or refuse assent with a noble sincerity. We have not the pleasure of being acquainted with her, but we have been told that she carries the same cordial manners into private life. The curtain falls, the play is at an end." And there's a little sketch there, which is supposed to be, I'm assuming, Charles Lamb and Mary Lamb. I found that a bit curious essay. We've got a bit of time here, and it just, um, yeah, it's like his letter to her proposing marriages. Yeah, I want to marry you. Well, we want to marry you. Me and my sister want to marry you. That's sort of what it's saying. And then saying that, he's all happy with this, but he's saying, in the letter back, is saying, I feel myself in a lackadaisical, no-howish kind of humor. I believe it is the rain or something. I had thought to have written seriously, but I fancy I succeeded best in epistles of mere fun, puns, and nonsense. And is he referring to the letters writing now, or the previous one that always just was all nonsense that he was? And then, and then he ends it with, don't paste this into your book. And it's not, please don't. It's just, do not paste that last letter of mine into your book. So I don't know how, yeah, I'm interpreting it maybe a little different than Newton has here. But anyway, it just was a little different, off pace a little bit. But I think it's where some of his essays will go with. It's talking about items that he owns and his collection and how he's come across them. But they will be a little more personal to him as well as to specific authors. Next one, I think, has to do with James Boswell. And then there's other ones that go through like that. But anyway, I will leave it there. And next time will be chapter 6. Thank you, BookTube.